All right, good morning. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul continues to defend himself, defend his apostleship and the things that he's been teaching. There have been false teachers who have come into Corinth after he had planted that new congregation and taught many people the gospel. And many people had obeyed the gospel, and of course, with that new congregation there, and many teaching the old law, going back to the law of Moses, Judaizing teachers, we sometimes call them, coming in after Paul and teaching people to go back to the old system that Christ had fulfilled, that Christ had brought to an end and established a new covenant, the church. But people were coming in and teaching to go back to that, and some were being deceived by this. So Paul is having to fight this and defend the accusations made against him. Notice some of the things that he said, which we covered last week. Just a reminder of some of the things that I found particularly interesting and noteworthy. In verse 20, this is 2 Corinthians 11, verse 20, he said, "For ye suffer if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you, if a man exalt himself, if a man smite you on the face." He said, you're willing to put up with all this from false teachers, but you're disregarding me as an apostle of Jesus Christ, as one who has come in and established this congregation and taught you the truth, and you're disregarding me. You put up with all this, but you're so quick to write off the things that I brought to you. And we left off last week. Paul was giving some of his history. He talked a little bit about his heritage. We noticed that in verse 22. He said, are they Hebrews? Well, so am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. So he talks about his nationality. He talks about his relationship to the old system, which the Judaizing teachers were trying to take them back to. So he relates to them that I'm well aware of all this. I'm well aware of the covenant that God made with Israel. But Christ fulfilled that covenant. We're now in the church. We're now in the new covenant. And of course, the end of that in verse 22, are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Both physical and spiritual, because the church is, we're considered, and Paul uses this description in other places as well, and the spiritual children of Abraham, God's people today. But then after that, he went into a reminder of some of the things that he had suffered for the cause of Christ. We'll start reading there, and we'll just go on down to the end of the chapter, beginning at verse 23. So 2 Corinthians 11, we'll begin reading at verse 23. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Now the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day have I been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by my own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils of the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, beside those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is offended, and I burn not? For I must needs glory. I will glory the things which concern mine infirmities. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is blessed forevermore, knoweth that I lie not. In Damascus, the governor Aretas, the king, kept the city of the Damascenes with a garrison desirous to apprehend me. And through a window in a basket I was let down by the wall and escaped his hands. All right. Pause there at the end of the chapter. Now we'll back up to where we began this reading of verse 23. He began asking a few more questions as he had done just previously, and then he goes into sufferings that he had endured for the cause of Christ. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I speak in human terms. Paul had worked harder and suffered more than certainly any of his adversaries that were in Corinth. And he says, I speak as a fool. I think using some irony there again, describing the necessity to describe it. He doesn't want to talk about these things. He doesn't want to have to remind them and even boast, to use a term that he'll use again here shortly. He doesn't want to do that, but he's finding it necessary to defend himself and remind them of who he is and who had proven himself to be already when he was there with them. And labors more abundant. Nobody's worked harder than Paul. In stripes above measure. Okay, what are we talking about when we say stripes above measure? Whippings, beatings. I think we left off talking about some of this last week. He had been beaten by both the Jews and the Romans, both. And he makes specific reference to some of this as well. And when we go into verse 24, he says, 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one, of the Jews. But also the stripes in verse 23 by the Gentiles, the Romans. We have one Roman beating recorded. Let's go look at it. Acts 26, I believe it is. Acts 26, verse 22 and 23. Go ahead and read it if you get there. Acts 26, verses 22 and 23. Oh, excuse me. I think it's 16. I'll get it right here in a minute, maybe. Let's find it. Is it Acts 16? Did I get it right? Yeah, Acts 16, 22 and 23. All right, thank you. So you look in the context, you back up a few verses. This is the Romans who are beating them. And who's the them? Who's being beaten? Paul, and who's with him at this time? You remember? Silas, exactly. So Paul and Silas being beaten by the Romans. And why? Because in verse 21, they're teaching customs which are not lawful for us to receive. Okay. Teaching things contrary to what they wanted to hear about Jesus, basically. But that's one example of a beating by the Romans. But also, you come back to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Oh, that's 1 Corinthians. That one didn't look right. He says, is in prison more frequent. And by the way, that same context in Acts chapter 16, what did they do with Paul and Silas after they beat them? Put them in prison. So there's another example of that as well. And that's not the only time that Paul was in prison for his work for the Lord. And prison's more frequent. And death's oft. He risked his life, I think is the idea there, for the cause of Christ time and time again, and was very nearly killed on at least one occasion. We'll talk about that in just a moment, a little more. But as we mentioned, of the Jews, we're going to verse 24, of the Jews, so we just saw the Roman beating, one example of that, and he says of the Jews 5 times received 40 stripes save one. So he had received 39 lashes. Why 39? Okay, somebody read for us. Well, I thought I wrote it down. Thank you. Yeah, I had it somewhere in my notes. Just didn't see it right offhand. Deuteronomy 25:3 states the law for the Jews of this type of discipline, this type of punishment. Deuteronomy 25 verse 3. Thank you, man. So the law limited this type of punishment to 40 lashes, 40 stripes. But the Jews had a practice of stopping at 39. I guess the idea, in case we miscounted, one don't want to exceed the law. It's caned, I think. Was that what it was? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Unreal to think of, and to think of why this was. It wasn't because he was spraying graffiti. He was a thief or anything. Why? Because he was teaching Jesus. Yet he kept doing it. It tells us something about Paul's character, doesn't it? Exactly. Right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's not counting the Roman beatings. That's the verse from the Jews. It's also interesting though, what we know from this, that Paul was beaten 5 times by the Jews. But when and where those things happen, we don't know. Those are not recorded for us. I just find that interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't want to talk about it now. But we don't have the specific record of all these things happening. But he's talking about it, mentioning now in defense of himself because of the false accusers that are bringing forth and trying to deny who he is and what he was teaching and all these sorts of things. But then in verse 25, thrice was I beaten with rods. We got more beatings. Once was I stoned. Now, do we know when and where he was stoned? We do know that one, don't we? So let's go read it. Acts 14, verses 19 and 20. Acts 14, verses 19 and 20. All right, thank you, ma'am. So now those 2 verses do not tell us where Paul was on this occasion, but do you remember from the context where he was? Lystra. He's in Lystra, and it's interesting that it wasn't the people from Lystra that really got this going, was it? Who was it? Yeah, people came from Jews specifically, came from Antioch and Iconium, and started to persuade the people against Paul, and apparently convinced them he needs to be stoned. Now, what normally happened to a person when they were stoned? They died. And at the end of verse 19 there, they finished stoning him, and what's it say? They supposed he'd been dead. You know, some think that he was dead, and he may have been, which is interesting to me in verse 20, because it says, howbeit, they suppose he's dead, so the people that were stoning him are leaving apparently. Howbeit, as the disciples stood round about him, he rose up and came to the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas and Derbe. I wonder if there's a miraculous, whether it's God raised him back up, and he was dead and God raised him back up, or God miraculously healed him. I wonder about that. It doesn't specifically tell us. The reason I say that is because he's in bad enough condition, they thought he was dead. But suddenly he gets back up, and the next day he's traveling again. That's amazing. But maybe he was dead and the Lord raised him back up, but he was left for dead and thought to be dead at the very least. And why? Because he was preaching the Messiah, preaching Jesus as the Messiah. And the Jews couldn't stand for it, or wouldn't stand for it. At best. Yeah. And he's traveling on, continue to teach the very next day. He's right back at it, isn't he? The next day. Continuing there in verse 25. I suffered shipwreck a night and a day, thrice, 3 times. Skipped a word there, don't miss that. I suffered shipwreck, a night and a day have I been in the deep. Now, do we have any record of Paul being in a shipwreck? We do. In Acts chapters 27 and 28. Where was he shipwrecked? And do you remember? Acts chapters 27 and 28 record the event of this shipwreck. Remember, there was an island that he ended up on? 2 names that I know this Melita, also called Malta, same island. But you know what? So we know this event, this one shipwreck that Paul was in, but you know what? I think that makes 4 at least. Here's why I say that. When did Paul write this letter? Well, we talked about when we first introduced these books, probably would have been in the mid to late 50s when Paul wrote this, and he's writing it on, I think it's second missionary journey, if memory serves me right. When did that shipwreck at Malta occur? Before? 62. Yeah. Well, after this. So that makes at least 4 shipwrecks, because the 3 that he references here, the one that we know about, hasn't happened yet. I think I might stop getting on a boat. Yep. That's recorded for us in Acts chapter 28. Remember, he was putting sticks on the fire, and the viper came out and bit him. People, they were amazed. He was not harmed. But, so 3 times at the time of this writing, at least 1 more time after this, he was in a shipwreck. And of course, he doesn't directly state it here, but of course, by the implication of he's talking about things that he's endured for the cause of Christ. So these shipwrecks were things that he endured while he was working. And the 4th one was too. A day and a night have been in the deep. And journeyings often. Well, we know a lot of Paul's journeys, not all of them, evidently. And perils of water. What does that? What does that mean? Yeah, don't know exactly. Well, I mean, was he stuck in a river, a stream? Was he caught in a flood? I don't know. But perils of water. Yep. And this at the end of verse 25, he said, a night and a day have I been in the deep, is King James. And as you go into verse 26, and journeyings often, then in perils of waters. In perils of robbers. And perils by my own. And as you read this, keep in mind, he's talking about what he's endured in his work of the Lord, not just everything he suffered ever in life. He's talking about things that he suffered in his work for the cause of Christ. And perils by my own countrymen. Who's that? Well, that's the Jews. He referenced some of that already. I was beaten 5 times by the Jews at this point in his work, in his ministry. And perils by his own countrymen, the Jews, and perils by the heathen. Who's that? That's the Gentiles. We talked a bit about what the Romans did earlier a little bit. Perils in the city and perils in the wilderness. Where can he go? He's suffering for the cause of Christ wherever he goes. And then again in perils of the sea and perils among false brethren. That's perhaps in a sense part of what he's dealing with even now. Some who may claim to be brethren but are bringing accusations against him, denying him, and perhaps on some occasions even being in physical danger because of false brethren. Questions, comments? Verse 27, in weariness and painfulness. That weariness is often, perhaps often, but interesting to me. Weariness, the idea there is pursuing sleep but can't find it. Ever been in that situation? I think all of us have experienced that at some point in our lives. But apparently that was a continual problem for Paul. And as you think about what he's just listed, maybe we can understand it a little bit. Constantly awake and restless, pursuing sleep, but unable to sleep. And watchings, as I would stated there. Often. Weariness often, but the watchings carries a very similar idea as well. And painfulness. The idea there of painfulness has to do with his work. He endured pain through his toil. Some translations even have the word toil there instead of painfulness. And hunger and thirst. And fastings. You know, some occasions, no doubt Paul would have gone without food by his own choice, fasting for some spiritual reason. But I get the impression here this was not by his own choice. Hunger, yeah. In hunger and thirst, in fastings often. And I wonder if that had something to do with his journeys. Maybe he didn't have enough food for his journey. So he's going hungry. He's fasting, yes, for the cause of Christ, in that he's traveling for the cause of Christ, but not by his own choice. He's not for some spiritual purpose of fasting and prayer and that sort of thing. This is something different. And going back to verse 27, in cold and nakedness. What do you think he's talking about there in cold and nakedness? What could it be referring to? Yeah. Reminded me of that as well. And that's 2 Timothy 4 and verse 13. It told Timothy, bring the cloak. He's cold. Why? Well, maybe his clothes have worn, maybe his shoes have worn out, clothes have worn out because of the travelings that he's been going through. Maybe that has something to do with it. But he doesn't have enough. He's going without. Why? For the work that he's doing. And he's reminding the brethren in Corinth of all, maybe not all, but at least some of the things that he's endured in his work for the cause of Christ. Now, verse 28, beside those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. Now, he just listed some things that I don't think we'll ever endure. He says, besides, he kind of sets those things aside. But besides all that, that which concerns me the most is what? That which brings the most weight on me. I'm concerned about the churches. He planted a good number of churches. And the weight of trying to see to them and keep them on the right path was heavy upon Paul. You know, this word without, in verse 28, the word without is interesting because it can be taken in a couple of different ways. You could say it means other than these things, outside of these things that I've been listing, you can take it that way. But this also can be taken as besides the things that I've endured on the outside of my body, my physical body. See, there's something internal that's weighing on him too. I don't know which way to take that. Maybe it's a little bit of both. But besides those things that are without, either outside of all these other things that I've endured or besides the outside of my body, the external pains that I've suffered, there's something bigger. There's something heavier upon me, the care of the churches. And you know what makes this kind of doubly interesting? This was what was weighing on him so much. The care of the churches and his work with the church, that's what caused all the other suffering that he endured. He's trying to build up the churches, these congregations that he'd established. He's trying to see to all the souls in his work. In doing that, in the heaviness on his heart, in doing all that is what brought all the physical suffering. Questions, comments?
Paul met with the Ephesian elders about to depart from them. See the great concern that he has for the church because he says, therefore watch and remember that by the space of 3 years I cease not to warn everyone night and day with fear. In other words, he was genuinely concerned about the cause of Christ.
Absolutely.
Obviously not in it for himself.
Not in any way. Great point.
In fact, he's not a narcissist. Narcissist is one who thinks it's all about him. And that in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 14 through 16, he says, for our light affliction, but for a moment, working for us far more than exceeding eternal weight of glory. Here's the key to that. While we look not on the things that are seen, but on the things that are not.
Absolutely.
So he realizes things that are seen are simple. Now then, they force his hand to have to bring these things up. And I just stand amazed at the focus.
Great point. Thank you for that good comment. How many of us would look at these sufferings that Paul said, I just light affliction? But Paul was able to say that because of what was coming after that, the goal, the end goal. Compared to the glory that awaited, all these things were light affliction to Paul. What a perspective. Maybe that'll help us put it into perspective when maybe we endure some things that aren't anywhere close to what Paul had to endure.
The terrain in Corinth and in Ephesus is very rocky. through there, doing stuff through those two areas, it take a toll on them.
Maybe his shoes got worn out, I'm sure.
And in Corinth, they had a little part where they had like a whipping stone.
Hmm.
So that's what they said. They said the stone, it was one of the stones in the little area where they said Paul was and where they whipped him at on that stone.
That'd be interesting. I know you and Janice went there, was it a year or two ago, something like that? That'd be an interesting trip to take. Thank you for the insight. Verse 29. Who is weak and I'm not weak? Perhaps Paul using some irony again there. You think about what he's not weak. You think about what he just described, perhaps using a bit of irony, trying to put it in perspective for the people that he's talking to. But then he says, who is offended and I burn not? I think Paul's talking about burning with righteous indignation. When look at it from Paul's perspective. You got someone that he has taught, that he has tried to nourish spiritually, tried to strengthen them, tried to bring them up, and then you see that person either deliberately sin and go against and rebel against God. Would that cause any righteous indignation? Or another situation, you got this person, this soul that Paul has cared for spiritually, and you got them being deceived by people that are denying Paul. Would that cause any righteous indignation? I think so. I think that's what's happening to Paul here. If any offend, who is offended and I burn not? If I must needs glory, I will glory. This is verse 30. If I must needs glory, I will glory in of the things which concern mine infirmity. Paul said, I'm going to boast in what shows my frailty, in what shows my struggles. I'm boasting in what shows my pain. I'm not gonna try to boast in my strength. This is what the false teachers are doing. They're building themselves up. Look how strong and great I am. Paul said, no, I'm showing you what I've suffered. I'm showing you my pain. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is blessed forevermore, knoweth that I lie not. Paul said, I'm not lying to you. I'm telling the truth. And God knows that I'm speaking the truth to you. Both right now in describing that I am who I claim to be, and I am truly an apostle, and by the things that I've just listed and what I've suffered for the cause of Christ, I'm not lying to you. And God knows it. Of course, that reminds me of Titus 1:2. What does that say about God? And it's part of his character. He cannot lie. God cannot lie, and he knows that Paul's not lying. God's a witness that I'm not lying. This text also, got a few minutes. This text also reminded me of Romans 9, verses 1 through 3.
Say the truth in Christ, I lie not. My conscience also bearing me witness. Holy Ghost, how great heaviness and continual sorrow in my heart. For I could wish that myself were accursed from Christ, from my brethren, my kinsmen, according to the flesh.
Thank you, sir. So he says again that I'm not lying. I have his love for his brethren, even his fleshly kinsmen, Jews, was so high. And I can't, it's hard for me to even grasp what Paul says here in verse 3. I would wish myself, if I could save my fleshly brethren, the Jews, I would wish myself accursed for Christ to save them. I can't even wrap my mind around that. But that's how much he cares about the people he's trying to bring to Christ, including the Jews. Then the chapter closes with another example of pain, struggle, peril that Paul endured because of his devotion to Christ. How on occasion his life was in danger, and he ended up being let out through a window to escape that danger. We got briefly, we can go look at another reference to it, Acts 9 and verse 16, I believe it is. 24, 25, thank you.
But Saul learned of their plans day and night and kept close watch on the city gate. His followers pursued by night and morning.
So we have another reference there to what Paul is describing, being let down in this basket. And I had verse 16 in my notes. Additionally, had 24 and 25 in my notes as well, but I had verse 16 in there because this is the words of Jesus here. He says, "For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake." Does that fit in with what we've been talking about? This is, of course, this is Lord talking about Paul and how he was going to suffer for the name of Christ. And absolutely he did, didn't he?
Paul could. Not that he say he deserved it, none of us deserve it. Good or bad, necessarily. But he was the one inflicting a lot of punishment. He was holding the garment
Yeah.
when they stoned Stephen to death. So he's probably in the back of his mind, or at least I would think, you know what, I've been over there. I can't complain about what I'm having to go through because I've inflicted this.
Yep. And he was willing to endure it. Just got a couple minutes left in our time this morning. Just a couple of thoughts to reflect on chapter 11. As you think about what Paul endured, I mean, let's ask ourselves, are we willing to endure for the cause of Christ? And how much would we endure? Now, I think the chances are pretty low that we'll have to endure anything close to what Paul endured. I don't think we'll be faced with things like that, not to that degree. But what would we be willing to endure? Can we at least be like Paul and be willing to whatever comes our way, that we're going to remain faithful to Christ and endure it, recognizing that's a light affliction in view of the glory that awaits? Sometimes it's just the slightest things that come into our lives and cause us to drift off the path. How easy would it have been for Paul to say, I don't know if this is worth it when he's enduring all the suffering. But sometimes something light may cause us to veer off. Second thought to keep in mind as we reflect on chapter 11, are we genuinely concerned about the condition of the church? That's something that weighed heavy on Paul. And I say that both as a congregation and as the church as a whole. How concerned are we about the condition of the church? And then one final question to ponder as we consider chapter 11. Are we willing to fight and stand up against false teaching, no matter what it might cost us? Because that's what Paul's doing right here. He's defending the truth against false teaching and suffering because of it. What are we willing to endure? Thank you, class. We'll look forward to next week and begin in chapter 12. I don't want to skip a whole chapter there.